Return of the Roar with Brenden Nunes, Frankie Cartoscelli, and Chris Watkins on Sactown Sports 1140.
Podcast coming to you here live. Brenden Nunes, Frankie Cartoscelli, Chris Watkins, live Return of the Roar podcast. Be here every Tuesday, 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. throughout the remainder of the Sacramento Kings postseason push, dare I call it, here as they sit in the play-in race, just coming off a loss last night against, remind me who we were against.
The New York Knicks.
The New York Knicks, yeah. That's right. A very forgettable game, so excuse me for wiping that one a little bit. It was over pretty quick, but the Kings had some success leading up to that. I think that given the recency of that Knicks game, Chris, we can kind of just start with your overall thoughts on a disappointing night for the Kings last night.
Yeah, I mean, that's really what it felt like, right? Is disappointment. Last time we talked, things were riding pretty high. The Kings were streaking, and we had kind of prophesized that the month of March was going to be a tough one, and the Kings were kind of blowing through all of that, looking really healthy, looking sharp, and then Domantas Sabonis and Malik Monk go down. I know we're going to talk about that a bit today, but really, that wasn't the problem for the Kings. The Kings actually found a little bit of a new identity without their two big time players in the rotation. And these past couple games against the Clippers, and then with a back-to-back against the Knicks on Monday, some are calling it a schedule loss. Some are saying that we're possibly starting to maybe see. I won't say the warts or the beginning of the end, but again, with you losing that game to the Clippers and what that means in the standings, maybe it is kind of the point in the season where you're really clawing up instead of feeling like you're in a battle with everybody. With the last week, we were talking about the 6 to 9, even 6 to 10 seed being separated by like a game and a half. That's just not the case anymore.
Yeah, and then Frankie Cartoscelli over here with us as well, obviously. Frank, what was your thoughts on last night's game after the Kings have been playing some really solid ball on both sides leading into that?
That I don't want to have to go to any more 7:30 tip-offs for the rest of the year. There's no more, right? That's it, I think. Those are horrible.
Yeah.
They're horrible. No, but really, I mean, aside from leaving the arena late after watching the Kings get beat by 30 points, just looking at the upcoming schedule as far as the matchups go, it is kind of a daunting, call last night an appetizer, if you will, of some tough matchups coming up. And then you get the news today that Golden State, who is already playing, I think they're 12-1 with Jimmy Butler since the trade. Someone gave me the stat last night. I'm not sure if that's accurate, but they're playing some great basketball. They get Jonathan Kuminga back on Thursday night, which of course seems like a lot of players make their comeback against the Kings, but it really was a lot of what we saw in New York a month or so ago, just getting bullied by the length. And you have OG Anunoby getting whatever he wanted. Mitchell Robinson down there battling on the boards. The Kings really finding no consistency, getting beat on the perimeter. Just what we've seen from this team all year long is that they struggle with 3-point defense. And it was more of a same, really. But, you look at that Clippers game from a couple nights ago, and are we having a different conversation and feeling a different way if Kawhi Leonard's shot rims out, which a crazy just left hand floater in the lane on. I don't know if you guys have seen that still, but all 5 Kings defenders were within, I think, arm's reach of Kawhi on that, and it still went down. But if that doesn't go in, maybe we're feeling a little bit better today, and the Kings are feeling like they're in a much better spot. But they're in a spot now where I think they can fall 4 games in the loss column, I think, behind Golden State, or maybe 5 losses in the loss column behind Golden State with the loss on Thursday. So I don't want to say must win already, but it's getting pretty close to that on Thursday night.
Yeah, currently 3 losses behind the Golden State Warriors, and that is 2.5 games behind Kings, currently sitting in 9th. Golden State there in the 6th seed. Obviously in this same group with Minnesota right there, the Clippers sitting there at 8th, and then Dallas. Actually, you're only a game ahead of Dallas, sitting there at 10th. Ideally, I think last episode we had even talked about, the Kings likely being in that 7 to 9 range, and I think that still sort of seems to be the projection here. But you mentioned that Clippers game, Kawhi Leonard hitting a tough lefty push shot that bounces on the rim a couple times before it finally goes down, and that's how you lose that one. The Denver game, I thought the Kings were really competitive throughout most of that. You're in Denver. You're without Domantas Sabonis. You have Keegan Murray guarding Nikola Jokic, Jake LaRavia guarding Nikola Jokic, and you almost have a chance in that game and sort of blow it at the end. Obviously, the New York game is kind of the outlier in that aspect. But, Chris, I think that they were 8th in defensive rating post All-Star break prior to that New York game. You factor that one in. Obviously, we're talking about a small sample size here. It only goes to 9 games, including that New York one, but they fall from 8th to 13th.
Wow.
After giving up 133
it was that bad.
To the New York Knicks. As you try to gauge, I think that had been one of the biggest question marks for this team. Shoot, I mean, you can go back a couple different iterations of Kings teams where defense has been a question mark, but in that recent stretch of growth, how much did you feel like some of it is sustainable? Does the New York game take away from all that? Or how much does it matter that this was against, Charlotte, Utah, Dallas?
Yeah. Well, that definitely plays a part of it for sure. I think it's a healthy combination of a lot of things. Like, frankly, I mean, it's been a conversation around Sacramento and really around the league more so than Sacramento. Like, is Domantas Sabonis? Can you have a functional top 10 defense with Domantas Sabonis as your center? And it is a little bit, I'll say, funny that Domantas Sabonis is out of the rotation with his injury, and the Kings all of a sudden are, at certain points of this stretch, like a top 3 defense, a top 2 defense in the NBA during that stretch. Like, I think that's some of it as well. But, I also wonder how much of it is just with Sabonis and Monk out of the rotation. Like, these guys are playing a lot slower, playing a lot more half-court offense, and letting DeMar DeRozan and Zach LaVine kind of do what we know they love to do, and that's kind of get into that isolation game and kind of work the one-on-one matchups. And, it's worked to varying degrees, I think, throughout this stretch. And I think it's kind of gone through varying degrees of whether or not it's aesthetically pleasing or not as well.
Yeah, Frank, what's your thoughts on how much you buy any of the recent defensive improvements, even though there was a step back last night?
Yeah, I talked about it with Dave and Jason a little bit. Just, is it a difference that Jonas is down there in the post? And I feel like, the 3-point defense has been kind of an Achilles heel for the Kings, because it does feel like they overcompensate on sealing off the paint to protect Domas, because Domas isn't really a rim protector. And that doesn't mean that Valanciunas is leaps and bounds better, but just looking at the last 5 games, in the games that he's filled in for Domas, 13.4 points per game, a hair under 13 rebounds per game, almost 5 assists, a steal, and 1 block per game. I mean, a couple of those games, the block numbers are higher, sure, but it does feel like the physicality and the presence he has in the post is a little different than what Domas brings. I think when we look at what Domas brings and his physicality, it's more on the offensive end, and the fact that he's able to take those hits and get to the basket and get those offensive boards and create second chance opportunities. But Valanciunas isn't really quite a rim protector by definition, but he is an enforcer, and he's someone that you can't really push around as much. And that's not a knock on Domas either, but I feel like, we look at it and the numbers, I think, show Domas has been a better defender this year. He hasn't been as bad as people would like to say he has been, especially in the past couple of years. But I just think that Valanciunas just requires a different kind of attention, and something that opposing offenses might pay a little more attention to than Domas.
Yeah, the physicality is definitely what jumps off the page with Valanciunas. He looks like he'd be very annoying to have to play against, constantly throwing bows, and just a very physical, aggressive player, I think, in a competitive way. Outside of the court, he seems like the nicest person on the planet, which is a hilarious sort of 2 sides there. But I think the physicality that he's provided, I think that Keegan Murray obviously has been a top tier defender throughout the course of this season. That's where he's taken the big step in his game. And I think that you've seen him be pretty locked in during this stretch. Again, a lot of this is maybe not including the New York game last night that we saw. That was a total disaster really for the Kings. But Keon Ellis getting more run in Malik Monk's absence, moving into that starting lineup. I think that the fan base has had a lot of questions, and maybe you guys do as well, of like who should be placed in that starting lineup. But I think what we know for sure is that Keon plays really well with those guys. And he's had a game of 5 steals, which is a career high. He had a couple 4-steal games throughout this stretch. It feels like, even though the Kings are playing with a slower pace, and I want to get to their offensive differences that we've seen a little bit later in the show here with some comments from Doug Christie on how that's functioning now after all these moves, but it seems like Keon Ellis is a guy that really took advantage of that opportunity, like he does really every time. But the question I want to ask you is, did anything stand out to you from any of those players as they got more opportunity in the absence of some of these guys?
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly Valanciunas definitely stuck out the most. I mean, he's so physically imposing. Like in some of these games, I feel like he had a couple 17 rebound games. throughout this stretch. Like, he's just been an absolute force, and you see how he can be incredibly productive in limited minutes. I mean, we've seen that with him coming off the bench, and then you kind of see it, how it can be, built upon if he gets more minutes. And, with Sabonis out and Trey Lyles really being the other option as a center. I know we've seen, Isaac Jones get minutes here and there. Scal has gotten minutes at the end of games, but for the most part, we've seen Valanciunas get these 30-minute performances, and dude's been putting up like near triple doubles, right? Like, he's had a couple games where he's had 6+ assists. And, I just think that he's really been somebody who, if you're talking about, doing what a sixth man is supposed to do, which has been a big conversation here in Sacramento, obviously with Malik Monk these past couple of years, Jonas Valanciunas brings you starter quality minutes while, coming off the bench and still being productive while coming off the bench. And, also on top of that, from a team building perspective, he's incredibly cheap, right? Like, he's $10 million, $12 million a year. He's exactly what you would want for in a backup big, and he's doing exactly what you would hope that a star backup can do. And that's when your star players have to miss a couple games, step up, and you really don't notice his production. And with how productive Domantas Sabonis is, like, that can't be understated enough.
Yeah, imagine what this would look like if they did not have Valanciunas on this roster. If we're still talking about Alex Len or Isaac Jones, or even the Trey Lyles minutes where he's playing small ball haven't been the greatest throughout this Domantas Sabonis injury. Frank, obviously we've seen Keon and Jonas step into that starting lineup, but you're getting more opportunity for some of these bench guys as well. Devin Carter getting a little bit of run recently. Have you been interested in anything you've seen from him, or, some of these other guys like Isaac Jones there, Markelle Fultz, Jake LaRavia?
Yeah, I think, getting something from those guys is you kind of have to at this point. I mean, the depth has been a concern all year long, and I think that the moves, you kind of have to tip your cap. And I think I've been critical on here. I think we've all been pretty critical of the front office making the moves that the Kings need, especially as at the forward position. They bring in Jake LaRavia, who played, I think, pretty decent defense on James Harden down the final stretch. There really isn't much you can do when he's going. And, the contest was there on a couple of those shots, and obviously Harden does what he does, and, MVP for a reason. So having Jake LaRavia in the mix, getting some minutes from Devin Carter, like you mentioned, have him show something after being in the G League for a little bit to develop. That's been important. I think he's someone I'm more looking to Summer League, and someone I'm not really expecting to do too much on the final stretch. I feel like he's someone I'd like to see kind of, take that leap in the summer, and especially in the next year, because right now the Kings, they really don't have a point guard. I mean, they have Markelle Fultz on the roster, and he's playing sporadically, but you bring up Keon Ellis, and Keon, the last 7 games, up to 30 minutes per night, which I think is something that fans have been waiting a long time for. 8.7 points per game, 3 rebounds, 2.1 steals, and a block and a half per game on 45% shooting from the field, 34 from 3. So that's kind of getting into that 6-man role the Kings have really wanted him to be, especially with Malik Monk starting now and being in that point guard role. Will Malik Monk work out long-term as the Kings point guard? That's a conversation maybe for the offseason and kind of as we get down the final stretch here. But I think Keon has proven that, number one, when that contract of his is up, I think he has one more year for 1.8 or 1.9 million. I think we talked about it last week. He's in line for a pretty big payday. And also he's in line for possibly being a starting level player. I mean, you can make the argument right now that he should be starting these games right now. And the fact that maybe he works better with those guys like DeMar and Zach in the lineup that are, ball dominant. Having 3 ball dominant guys in the starting lineup might not be what works for the Kings. It might need more defense in there. So seeing Jake LaRavia, seeing Keon Valanciunas kind of, provide the Kings that depth they've been looking for is great, but it's got to translate to wins sooner than later.
Yeah, I want to dive more into what you were just saying there, Frank, the starting lineup conversation, which I know can be a little bit tiring, but I think every point that you just laid out there is why people would say, hey, maybe Keon should slide in here. And then the question becomes, are we talking for Malik Monk, DeMar DeRozan, Zach LaVine? I think it's probably Malik Monk if we're having that conversation. But just what's your perspective, Frank, on how much that even matters, and how much thought you would give towards potentially making a change there?
I think it mattered more earlier. I think right now the lineup they have is kind of what they have to stick with. Like, I don't want to say the bed is made at the lie in it. I mean, it's not that drastic. There's still, I think, 18 games left, so you could make a shakeup down the final stretch. But it just seems like that's not what's going to happen. And it seems like Malik made it pretty clear that he wanted to start before Mike Brown was fired. I mean, that's been a topic of conversation for a long time, and I don't think he'd be pleased to go back into a reserve role as much as I think, and I would put him back in that role, because I feel like what made the Kings so good over the past 2 years is Malik Monk being in that bench role and having the versatility of having a player who can be a bench scorer, because right now the balance isn't really there. Like I mentioned, Laravia is playing well. He's in the shots now. Valanciunas is providing backup minutes, or now starting minutes with Sabonis hurt, which is a huge plus. And you need bench scoring though. Keon Ellis is a great spot up shooter, and he's created a little bit more over the past couple of weeks. But having a microwave type scorer like Malik on the bench and having Zach and DeMar kind of run the show on the starting lineup, that's the balance the Kings need, and that's the balance that they had when they went to the playoffs 2 years ago with Fox in the starting lineup. So I would make that lineup change, but it seems like the Doug isn't going to do it. And, we'll see if it works out for the best. Maybe the Kings find that chemistry, and they were playing good basketball before the injury started popping up. So maybe they can get back to it. But I do feel like it's a conversation that's going to have to happen sooner or later. Does Malik Monk belong in the starting lineup, or is he best suited as a reserve player?
Yeah, no. And I think you kind of touched on something there. Like, I wonder how much of the front office's willingness to move on from De'Aaron Fox was part of, hey, Malik Monk, we want to see what you look like potentially as this team's point guard moving forward. And, to that point, Frank, like, I don't know if they want to give up on that experiment yet. Like if they made a move as drastic as moving Fox in order to get Monk in that kind of spot in that situation, I don't think they'll give up on it. What are we, 12, 15 games post trade? It feels like that's something that you probably want to give a decent look. Not saying that is the case, but if that was part of their calculation, their evaluation at all, it feels like you probably want to give that a little bit more run.
Yeah, some interesting decisions for interim head coach Doug Christie to try and figure out here, as I believe we have about 19 games remaining in this 2024-25 season for the Sacramento. Keen on what happens with the closing lineup, and should Keon be part of that? Going to dive into that and some of the offensive identity changes that we've noticed with this team post All-Star deadline or All-Star break as Zach LaVine becomes part of this group. So stay tuned for all that here on the other side of the Return of the Roar podcast on Sactown Sports 1140.
You ever try fixing your car and realize you're missing that one part? Yeah, been there.
Your flagship station for the Beam Team, Sactown Sports.
Brenden Nunes, Chris Watkins, Frankie Cartoscelli, Return of the Roar podcast here. Be here for the rest of the Sacramento Kings postseason push, Tuesday, 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. Started the show talking about some of their recent defensive improvements that we've seen, how sustainable that may be, as it all came crashing down last night, Monday night at Golden One Center with a 133-104 loss to the New York Knicks. But on the other side of the ball, where the Kings have really made their money over the last few years offensively, obviously a new look with Zach LaVine replacing De'Aaron Fox. You got Jonas
Station in
Valanciunas.
Sacramento, giving you local sports coverage from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. Monday through Friday. Sactown Sports.
It is true. It is true.
It's
6
true.
p.m. 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. 7 p.m. as well. Or we go to 7 now.
Yeah,
as
yeah.
well
Yeah.
here on Tuesdays. So,
Right.
but you're seeing some of these new additions change the look of the offense. And post All-Star break, the Kings are still 6th. But when it comes to pace, something that was really a key identity for this team, not so much this year, but in years prior with De'Aaron Fox, Domantas Sabonis playing into that, 27th in pace for the Kings post All-Star break. Obviously, a lot of isolation ball with Zach LaVine, DeMar DeRozan. But we'll start with you, Frank. Just curious, what have your thoughts been on stylistically how different Sacramento's offense feels and the production that it's had?
Yeah, I feel like the offense is kind of stagnant at times because, like, I think I mentioned to you last night when we were watching the game, it just kind of felt like it's really DeMar or Zach kind of coming, bring the ball down, and maybe a ball screen gets them free, but it really kind of just begins and ends with them. I mean, what can they create on each possession? And there are times where Keegan is open and Zach or DeMar will find him, but more times than not, the possession ends in a shot from DeRozan or LaVine. So they're kind of one dimensional that way, and getting Malik Monk will help a little bit, I think, in that regard, but. What hasn't changed is the fact that they're still reliant on the three ball, it seems. And last night they shoot under 30%, and just on the year as a whole, they're 14-3 when shooting over 40%, 5-12 when shooting under 30%. And that includes last night's loss. So, and that doesn't even include, the defense as well. The last one I had was the defense, 6-20 when allowing a team to shoot 40% from three. That's a 23% winning percentage. So, but the offense, it begins and ends there. I mean, the Kings, this model of this team, which is completely different from what it was 2 years ago now, but the bones are still there of that structure, as they live and die by the three. If the threes are falling, they're going to be in a good spot. And right now, they're kind of inconsistent there. And getting Zach LaVine to get going, and Western Conference player of the week last week, that helped. Having Jake LaRavia kind of dig himself out of that hole he was in when he came over to Sacramento, that helps. Keon Ellis continuing to be a plus there. they have the shooters to get it done, and Keegan Murray doing more as well there. I think the Kings are in a good spot, but consistency is going to be key. And the teams they have coming up, you have Cleveland twice, OKC, Boston, Memphis. I mean, these are good defensive teams you're going to have to play and get lucky on the perimeter. And you saw last night with the Knicks, who metrically aren't a great defensive team, but the players they have in the personnel, the forwards they have, they were able to make the Kings uncomfortable and make them work at it. And bad things happen when the Kings would go against teams with that kind of build.
Yeah, Chris, part of that new look offense, the stylistic differences of playing slower, the reliance on three-point shooting that still remains, like Frankie pointed out, is, the saying I think that we've all heard a lot is there's too many cooks in the kitchen at times, right? A lot of just hoopers out there on the floor. They can all get buckets, but how can they all help enable one another? And the shot diet obviously becomes a question when that's the case, and no Malik Monk plays a part, no Domantas Sabonis, but I think this was before our last recording as well, but you have a night where DeMar DeRozan shoots the ball 32 times in Denver, as the game slows down. He also has a double-double against the Clippers with 10 assists and 31 points right there on 20 shots. You have Zach LaVine trying to be a little bit more of a playmaker. So it's almost like guys are in maybe unideal is the best way to say it, situations where they're not optimizing their talents, but all trying to make everything fit. What have you thought of the shot diet? And is there anybody that you're like, that guy just needs to honestly be a little bit more selfish out there?
Yeah, I think it's looked all right to me these past couple of games. Like you said, I mean, it probably does help in a weird way to have, though even saying that, we were having conversations last week about how the shot distribution was super even with Sabonis playing, with Monk playing. And I do kind of think that with those two guys out of the lineup these past couple games, like it's still kind of made sense. I think DeMar, you mentioned the 32 shots against Denver, like that was clearly too much. And we've also kind of talked about Zach LaVine and his aggressiveness at times since getting here. I think you're really starting to see him especially get really comfortable. I mean, 2 of his last 3 games, he's had over 30 points. You really start to see him kind of taking ownership of this team. Like Zach is maybe the best scorer on this team, arguably, if not DeMar, maybe some nights you could say Malik, but I think Zach, considering especially his age and everything, like this should be his team, all things considered. And I think you're starting to see him kind of embrace that identity a little bit. And I think the biggest thing in terms of shot diet is Keegan Murray and where he falls on that. And, it's been a pretty fluctuating situation with Keegan's shot attempts, as we've known throughout his career, but definitely specifically this season. And, to me, that's really the key for I think how we feel about the shot diet is, can we get Keegan? I think we've said like 8 attempts. Can he get up to 10? I think that's really where you start to notice when guys aren't sharing the ball enough, is when guys like Keon should be thrown in there as well, aren't really getting the looks that we feel like they should.
A lot of mouths to feed, and there is only so much food to go around when it comes down to it. Our buddy Matt George asked Coach Doug Christie a little bit about some of the offensive shot diet, and Doug was quick to correct him a little bit on some of maybe how he worded the question here, but I thought it was interesting insight from Doug Christie here on how their offense is functioning.
DC, you just touched on this a little bit. You have 2 really gifted isolation scorers in DeRozan and LaVine. You've also talked about wanting to have a kind of a free-flowing offense, not drop plays or anything like that.
No, we draw plays.
Well, okay,
what is it right?
What is the balance with letting them rock and letting them do their thing in isolation and wanting them to move the basketball out of those spots? Where's that balance?
Well, the balance is breaking the shot clock down into 3 sections. The first section is transition and flow. So that's 8 seconds. The second is getting ourselves into sets if that first flow isn't there. And then the last 8 seconds is when you get to your business, because that's what they do. That's what they get paid to do. But to get there, you got to trust your teammates, get out and run. What's there? What's there? Nothing's there. Boom, set it out. Okay, elbow. Okay, boom, he pops. Nothing's there. Now we're down to butter clock. That's where they're special at. But if you don't allow yourself to get there, now you find yourself in a world of trouble versus a really good defensive team. And what I'm saying, you have to spend energy to do that. That ain't easy. There's trust involved in that. There's a lot of different things that involve. It sounds easy, but I'm from somebody who did it my whole life. That ain't easy, man, because These guys are physical. They're letting them touch you. All of a sudden you get in your feelings because I don't want to be touched, and I'm about to show you I got game. We can't get personal like that. Let it do what it do. Get out and run. If it's there, great. If it's not, set up something. It could be simple. It could just be a drag. As soon as the drag starts, kick the ball ahead, still nothing. Call somebody into a ghost screen in the last 8 seconds, and we got 2 of the best ISO players in the league. Bang.
I mean, that's crazy. Like, I do really love to hear Doug go into that kind of detail because, you know, that's one of those situations where, you know, just hearing more specifically about him breaking down the clock, like, you know, that's just another level of like basketball watching that you can get to. Like, you know, obviously you can kind of passively watch it. You can just watch for the highlights. But when you start really breaking down the shot clock, like, and Doug's, you know, talked about breaking the shot clock down in that fashion before, but it really just tells you like how much is going in to all of this. You know, a lot of people on the internet will say, you know, oh man, like they're just vibing out there. Like you said, they're just hoopers out there hooping. Like, what is coach doing? All those kind of stuff. Like when you hear that level of attention to detail given, it's just absolutely insane how much is going on the floor all at once.
First 8 seconds to transition, next 8 seconds going to trying to get into sets. And the final 8 seconds is just go get a bucket. He called it butter time, I think he said.
Really?
Wow.
And it seems like they get to butter time a lot as a team that's bottom 5 in pace post All-Star break.
You
Yeah,
can manipulate that if you want. You can just dribble the ball out until you get to
true.
those final
It's
8.
true. We only got 2 more seconds till we're at 8 here. I'm
Yeah.
going to take a couple more dribbles.
I mean, it seems like that's what happens a lot anyway. I mean, not to throw stones. I mean, I see a lot of people throwing comments at me on Twitter saying, "But DeRozan dribbling the air out of the ball," and it's like, I mean, okay, sometimes sure. I mean, there are sets. I mean, not just the Kings. A lot of players in the league, you know, that happens a lot. But yeah, I do think it's interesting. And yeah, the Kings do seem like they're pretty good late in the shot clock. But I mean, I don't think you want to bank on that every time. I mean, isn't that kind of a gamble at a certain point where you're just kind of
Definitely
saying, okay, yeah, you have 2 players that are very clutch and they work well late in, you know, situations, whether it's a shot clock or a game late in a game situation. But, you know, I like to see the Kings have so many times we see a play happen. And I think we're past the point where we're saying these are guys trying to get familiar with each other. These are guys that are still kind of lost and they don't know exactly what they're supposed to be. And, you know, the defensive end actually seems like they're a little more in sync, which is crazy to say. I mean, maybe not last night for sure. You have 130 points and you allow a team to shoot 50%. They got so many open looks last night. So definitely not last night. But leading into last night, the defense seems to me like they're more in sync as a unit. And the offense is really where they're trying to get more comfortable and find other ways to score that don't have to end with, like you said, butter time or DeMar or Zach are bailing out a bad possession. I mean, that's not winning basketball. So if they can find a way to kind of get to that sweet spot and have good possessions consistently.
Your home for Kings basketball for
always, then I think that, you know, they could be in a good spot come mid-April.
Absolutely. A decent amount of games still to be played here as they're fighting for their standing in the crowded Western Conference play-in picture, maybe even hoping to get to that 6th seed, even though it doesn't seem like the most likely. When we come back here in the final segment, we try to make sense of what's real and what's not with this Kings team post All-Star break as they've fumbled a little bit after coming out to a pretty hot start. But you're listening to the weekly Return of the Roar live podcast here on Sactown Sports 1140. Stay tuned on the other side for one more segment here. Spinning up and down post All-Star break for the Sacramento Kings. Diving into that here on the Return of the Roar live show. Brenden Nunes, Frankie Cartoscelli, Chris Watkins. So I'll walk you through a little bit of this post All-Star break schedule. Not a little bit. Let's go through the whole thing real quick. There's not that many games. First, you start with a very bad loss to the Golden State Warriors at home, 132-108. We'd like to be able to forget that one a little bit. You can chalk that up to, you know, first game back, Warriors are rolling, Kings are still getting adjusted. Handful of the excuses that you could use if you wanted. And then they take care of business against the Hornets, 130-88. You go on the road, start a road trip. You beat the Jazz, 118-101. And then go to the Houston Rockets, maybe the best win post All-Star break. Got to be the best win, actually. 113-103 in Houston. You beat a beat-up Dallas Mavericks team that has Kessler Edwards as their starting center, 122-98. A narrow loss to the Denver Nuggets at Denver, Mile High City, 116-110. A You beat the San Antonio Spurs. De'Aaron Fox's return to Golden One Center in a pretty anticlimactic game, 127-109. Narrowly lose to the Clippers in overtime off a Kawhi lefty push shot that bounced on the rim a couple times before it went in at the buzzer. And then you get blown out by the Knicks at home Monday night, last night, 133-104. Chris, I'll start with you as we try to get a better feel for this group post All-Star break, post trade deadline, whatever stretch you really want to look at with this group. Is there anything that you feel like you can confidently say that you expect to see on a night-to-night basis? Like, is, trying to figure out what the identity of this team is right now, which was, to be fair, already a question mark before you made these moves. Right. And now this is just an added complication. Yeah. But do you have any feel for what a potential identity of this team is?
Not really. And I'd be fascinated to hear if you guys have really been able to figure anything out. But I mean, in a nice way, I would say that multiple contributors is maybe something. I think there have been points throughout this Kings recent Beam team tenure, if you will, where if it wasn't De'Aaron Fox, Sabonis, and Monk, and then some version of either Keegan or Kevin Huerter or some other player giving them some production, they were probably going to struggle. I think the one thing we have seen is, a random Jake LaRavia 15-point performance or quarter in Denver. We've seen Trey Lyles have some impact. We've seen, Keegan have some big impact. Of course, it's going to be mainly DeMar and Levine on most nights. But again, Jonas Valanciunas been incredibly productive. To me, that's the one thing that really jumps to center of mind is just in general, it feels like you're going to get multiple guys contributing to a win. I would say maybe to contrast that, like in the losses, sometimes it does kind of feel like you're just missing that extra pop from a Keon, from a Jonas maybe, or from a Jake LaRavia, Trey Lyles. So I'd probably go with depth being the number one thing.
Frank, what do you feel like you can confidently say you're going to see every night in a Kings game right now?
Right now, I think you're going to see some turnovers. I'm looking at their numbers post All-Star break, and they're averaging around 14 turnovers per game, which, that's not too horrible or too egregious, but there have been a couple nights where you see the turnovers in the, 24 in that Warriors game, 18 the game after, 16, 14. Now, the last couple of games have actually been in a pretty good spot outside of last night. Last night, they went back to 18 turnovers, but really the sample size, I went back to the Golden State game. It's 9 games now in this post-All-Star break. They're 5-4. That's winning more than losing is always good, but 49% from the field. They're around almost 40% from 3, which again, the 3-point shot seems like the 3-point shot seems like it's come around, but 3-point defense still, you're allowing opponents to shoot 38%. Last night we were laughing about it. The 2 worst 3-point defenses in the league, only the Knicks were able to kind of go against the grain there, and the Kings allowed them to shoot 50% like we talked about as well. But I think you're going to see a mixed bag on the perimeter. You're going to see them, maybe they're going to knock it down and shoot the lights out, but I think you're going to go ahead and bank on an opposing team shooting well from that area. So you kind of have to hold your own there, and you have to, hope that players like Keegan Murray, Jake LaRavia, Domantas Sabonis when he comes back, is he going to continue to shoot the 3? He was really sputtering when he was, in those games after the All-Star break before he got hurt. His shot seemed like it kind of had fallen off, and this is a player that people were joking about on social media that was leading the league in 3-point shooting on really low volume, granted, but his floor spacing was better this year, and, opposing defenses had to pay attention to it. So I do think the Kings right now, they're still trying to find it on offense. The perimeter looks like it's working better for them. But like we talked about the last segment, they have to find more cohesiveness and not get into that quote unquote butter zone where they're having to force shots in the last 8 seconds of a shot clock.
Random tidbit too. They posted it in the pregame of the arena on the scoreboard. Zach LaVine right now is averaging a 50-40-90, 50% from the field. He's at 51.4%, 40% from 3. He's at 41.3%. And then from the free throw line, 90.9%. They said he'd be the first player in franchise history to accomplish the 50-40-90. I don't know if it really counts because it's only on half a season, but Brenden, I want to hear if there's been any identity that you've found since the All-Star break.
Yeah, the Zach stuff real quick is funny. Yeah, 15 games. I mean, he is a super efficient player, and that's what he's known to do, but we'll see how much the numbers stick, and I think that it deserves an asterisk if we're going to say that's the first guy in Kings history to do that in a season. But doing it 23.5 points is definitely impressive. I would say identity-wise for this team, I think it kind of all centers around mismatches on both pros and cons. Like if you're against the Utah Jazz are going to get picked apart. You know what I mean? That's an obvious one. But even you go against the Denver Nuggets, like give me Jamal Murray every single time down the floor. You go against the San Antonio Spurs, it's like DeMar DeRozan or Zach LaVine. It's like, hey, give me Chris Paul, and you're looking for those matchups. And I think that the same thing happens on the other end, that maybe it's not isolation ball for these other teams, but it's, hey, let's make sure that DeMar DeRozan and Zach LaVine are having to chase through screens off ball. And because, to be blunt, those guys both tend to get lost a little bit sometimes in some of their off-ball coverages. And that could be a function of communication with a new group and things like that. But I think that you're seeing a lot of isolation basketball in a lot of these games, a lot of mismatch hunting, which is the nature of a lot of the modern NBA. But is it just me, or does this feel like a very old school team? Maybe it's the foot on the line, long twos from DeMar DeRozan, where he's just the king of that. And I feel weird, like feeling a type of way about it because he's an absolute bucket and 27th or something along those lines in all-time NBA scoring. So who am I to say anything? You got Jonas Valanciunas posting up out here, but style of play definitely feels very different for this Kings group right now, and kind of a throwback.
No, completely agree. And, you have to hope you see more of it. And I'm just looking forward to see how they adapt to these tough opposing defenses. And it's funny looking at the NBA strength of schedule, the remaining schedule.
Oh, gosh.
Do you want me to read you guys some of the quote unquote easiest opponents left?
Please do.
So there's toughest. If you go on Tankathon, which is a pretty good site for these kind of things, and we're not quite looking at the mock drafts yet, or the draft yet, by the way, because again, I think
might not have a pick.
Might not have a pick right now. It does. It looks like on the mock draft, which I had. Look, sue me. I looked at it. It goes to Atlanta. But the easiest opponents up for the Kings right now. You have a couple. You have Washington, Charlotte, sure, Chicago. Now, these couple of games, I don't really agree as far as an easy looked forward to as a relief from the schedule. Orlando, who's been very hurt this year, but obviously they have the talent to beat you on a nightly basis. Phoenix, who's been a dumpster fire, granted, but they definitely have the players, and if they're healthy, that can beat the Kings. They have Phoenix twice. Portland, who has been playing pretty well, and they challenged the Warriors the other night. They fell up behind late in the game, but the Kings already lost to Portland on the road earlier. So I'm looking at those easiest opponents, and there's 3 games you can look at for the rest of the way and say, okay, those are games that the Kings absolutely should win. And the other games, like you're mentioning, the offense, what will it look like against these tough defenses? You get Cleveland twice, Oklahoma City on a back-to-back after facing Boston, I'm pretty sure. Then you get Denver, Memphis, and Milwaukee. So I'm not really, and also Golden State, which isn't mentioned on here. Golden State on Thursday, who's are the hottest team in the league right now. So the offense really is going to be tested. And I have a lot of friends text me saying what are they going to do in the offseason? What's the plan? Like who on this roster is going to be here in October? I feel like we're going to go ahead and see what that verdict is over the next 18 games and what the plan is, because I personally feel like I think the ceiling's really low for this group. I think, Brenden, you've said it before. Chris, I know you've said it. I've heard others say it around the media dining table that the ceiling on this group is just pretty low. And just what is the long-term fit? I mean, Zach LaVine just turned 30. Domantas Sabonis is going to meet with the organization in the offseason and see what direction he feels like they're going. He has a huge contract, though. I'm not sure if the Kings could move him if they wanted to. So very intrigued to see if they can find the right formula, be a good offensive team, be as good as they were that Beam team year, score 120 plus points per game, up their pace, knock down threes, play with some excitement. Can they do that consistently and not be a zero on the defensive end? That is going to be the main thing to watch for over the final stretch here. And if they make it to the playoffs, you can't say they didn't earn it on that upcoming schedule, man. It's brutal.
And even just looking at not to get way too far ahead of ourselves, but while we're mentioning the schedule, the Kings' last 5 games of the year at Cleveland, at Detroit, versus Denver, versus Clippers, versus Phoenix. Again, like Phoenix isn't necessarily as scary as that might have looked at the beginning of the year, but that is an absolutely brutal, no easy games type of end of schedule there, where it's not very easy before that stretch either. But if you put yourself in a situation here where you need to catch up, or maybe even hold serve in a standings race, that's about as brutal of a schedule as you're going to find the last week of the season.
3 to maybe 5 games where they're going to be favored over these last, I believe it's 18 games remaining on this schedule. And as we just laid out, not being very confident in what the identity of this group is or what you can even expect on a nightly basis. They sit 9th in the Western Conference, 2 games behind 8th. You are 2.5 games behind, 3.5 games behind the 6th seed, and also 1 game above 10th. Again, very crowded, sort of 6 to 10 range here in this Western Conference. And it's a vague question that we ask all the time, but I think that we got to keep taking the pulse here as we get a bit closer here and the standings start to shake up. What is your confidence level in this team? I think that at this point, saying that they're going to be in the play-in, I feel very good about personally. I'd imagine that you guys are the same. Let me know if you feel any different, but how competitive they may be in the time leading up to that, because I think that it's important to carry some momentum into a, one game determines everything in these play-in circumstances. So, as we mentioned, not having a great feel on this team, what is your confidence level that they can win more of these games than they're like quote unquote supposed to, given the difficulty of schedule here?
I mean, I don't have much confidence that they will overperform. I don't even know what really the expectation would be for them at this point with how tough the competition is ahead of them. In terms of like where the season ends, it feels like to me, you can feel good about yourself if you make it out of the play-in situation. If you can be the 9 seed that makes it to play the 8 seed, sure, that'd be great. But I think overall the problem is what lies ahead for you after you win that prize is the Oklahoma City Thunder more than likely.
Yeah, and I even looked at the bracket today and saw that it is Dallas and Minnesota. Teams I think the Kings would match up very well against. Dallas for obvious reasons, and Minnesota, they've played pretty well against them, even with Gobert. I do think that, like you said, though, Chris, how much does that really mean or matter if the Kings make the playoffs and get swept or gentlemen swept by OKC? Right. Is that something that you can look at and say, as an organization, they're going to grow from that? That's a step forward. I mean, that's up for you to decide. The fan. How do you feel about that? Do you think the Kings make it to the first round and they beat OKC in 1 game? Is that enough to hang your hat on and say, okay, they can build around this Levine, DeRozan, Sabonis group for 1 more year? I'm not quite sold on it. I feel like there needs to be more than that. But at the same time, you want to be playing postseason basketball rather than not, and that's the most important thing here.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll see what the Kings can accomplish over these next 18 games, and we'll be keeping you up to date here every Tuesday, 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. on the Return of the Roar podcast here. Thanks to everybody for listening. Be sure to stay tuned here, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. Sactown Sports, Monday to Friday.
The Amish have a reputation for craftsmanship, determination, and quality. Hi, this is Frank LaRosa with a word about Naturewood Home Furnishings. Those